Okay, welcome everyone to another AMA DocSIG webinar. Appreciate everyone joining. Today, we are really excited to have Dr. Bhargave here to talk about generating research ideas. This topic is really interesting because we actually have some pairing topics at Winter AMA. As you all know, Winter AMA is around the corner, and it's DocSIG's job to kind of act as a resource arm for all doctoral students and young faculty. And so I'm going to drop a link in the chat before we get started. This is a PDF that our media team put together talking about the pre-AMA webinar series, which you're at right now. And then there's the virtual session of AMA that you can just attend virtually February 10th and the 11th, where we will have a contribution to knowledge webinar on the virtual session. And then the in-person session is February 18th to the 20th in Las Vegas. And so if you attend the in-person, you get the virtual for free, or you can just attend the virtual. But at the in-person session, along with the Mentors Breakfast, we're also going to be having asking interesting research questions. And so with this, we were talking beforehand, that this is maybe a more practical look at generating research ideas. And then when you come to the conference, you can pair that with asking interesting questions. And so with that, I want to, again, thank you for your time. Those of us that are, we try to plan it around the central time. I know that 2 p.m. then puts you guys at 8, 9 p.m., depending on where you're at. So we really appreciate you all coming. Ezra is our Vice Chair of Special Projects and Partnerships. It's been her mission and forefront to make this webinar series as popular as it's been. So we owe her credit for that. And spearheading this is with us is Kevin. I see some other DocSIG members in there, like with Brandon, Brittany, Melanie. Maybe there's a few that I'm missing, but Ezra's the one that I was utilizing her contact list and said we have to bring Dr. Bhargave in. So I'm going to kick it off to Ezra before we begin, so she can do an introduction, and then we'll get going.
Hello everyone. So just for starters, I hope the noise isn't bad in the background. It's not under my control a little bit. So yeah, I'm happy. Well, we're all happy to welcome Dr. Bhargave today. And he's been kind enough to lend us some of his time to walk us and all our doctoral students through how to think of research ideas and possibly even how to manage a bunch of projects together is something we're going to tap on today. Dr. Bhargave has had his PhD from Wharton Business School, is currently an associate professor of marketing at Imperial. And some of his research interests are around product evaluations in social context of consumers, as well as consumers' decision making, especially choice through their online tools. So yes, so it's an exciting bunch of different research interests. So hopefully it could help us spark us some ideas for our projects as well. So over to Dr. Bhargave.
Thank you, Ezra. Thanks for that very warm welcome. And thank you all for joining today, taking the time out on this session. I want to start by just getting an idea of who our audience is today. So of course we have the DocSIG group. What about the rest of our audience? And you can put it through in the chat just so I have a good sense of where people are logging in from. So if you could just, in the chat, just tell us where you're located, which university, or if you're not at your university currently, if you're located somewhere else, put that through where you're located. And also if you have the opportunity, just type in, what are you studying? What area are you in? Are you consumer behavior strategy? Are you on the quant side? Maybe that gives us a good sense of our audience. Okay, we have some strategy. We have HEC Paris, FIU in Miami. We have at Florida State and Drexel. Quite a few places represented. That's great. Nice to see a global audience. So we have, it's over here, it's 8 p.m. Anyone in a less social time? We got 2 p.m. back to Central Time Zone. We have some 9 p.m.ers. What about in Melbourne? What time is it there right now? Let's see. Nissim is in Melbourne. 7 a.m. Okay, that's not too. 12 p.m., 7 a.m. Quite a few different times. So thanks for joining at these various times. 1:40 a.m. in India for Jan. So Thanks for taking the time out. Okay, so to make this webinar most effective, I will also ask for you to participate at different times, answer some questions, sometimes through the chat, and sometimes maybe through actual voice. And I think you can feel free to later ask questions or even throughout. Okay, let me share my screen. All right, everyone sees the title page, right? Okay, great. All right, so we're talking today about how to develop research topics from idea generation to project completion. And the agenda, we're going to talk about how to spark research ideas, finding your niche. I'll touch on that a little bit. And many of the practicalities of this, including slow motion multitasking, failing fast, and managing a sufficient research pipeline. And I'll try to keep it really more at a concrete level if possible. So if you need more examples, I'm happy to focus on that as well. First, a little bit about me. Ezra, thanks again for the lovely introduction. I've been here at Imperial College Business School since 2016. My background, as Ezra said, I did my PhD from the Wharton School. Then I'm from Texas, so I grew up in Austin. I moved back to Texas to San Antonio, and I was assistant professor of marketing there for several years, and moved out here and made the transition across the pond. And I can talk about that later on if you have questions about moving from the US to the UK. As I mentioned, my area is consumer behavior. As far as my engagement with PhD students over here in the marketing group, I work with one of the PhD students who's finishing up fairly soon. And then we have a number of other PhD students that I teach on the consumer behavior module for the PhD course and experimental design and analysis. So some of what I'm going to be showing you today also comes from the PhD courses that I teach here at Imperial. I also have had the pleasure of hosting with some of the other schools here in London. We host a marketing camp. And that's been a great collaboration as well to expand our network. And I hope that all of you are also doing some of that, meeting the PhD students in your region, just to increase your network like that. All right, so that's a little bit about me. Now, what I'm going to talk about is developing research ideas. And as I go through this, I want to give a key disclaimer here, is that everyone develops research ideas in their own way. So what may work for me may not work for you. But what I hope is that together we can share different tips of what we've used to develop research ideas. And no matter how good you get at this, how effective you are at developing and screening research ideas, it is still always going to be a massive challenge, because coming up with good research ideas, even for the most talented, most experienced, is extremely difficult. So I fail at this all the time as well. And so what I really just want to do is share the experiences that I've been through here, what I've discovered over time about developing research ideas. The key thing that I really want you to take away from all this is that coming up with good research ideas is not just a series of accidents. It really helps to have a methodical approach to this. Come up with whatever the method you feel is right for you. And as I said, we'll share a few ideas. And take note of what works and what doesn't work for you to really try to optimize this process. So like a lot of things, it is a process that can be improved. The only difference is the feedback takes a very long time. So it's not as easy to train with this as it is to train with a basic skill like juggling. Okay? So we're going to first start with sparking the research ideas. Where do we get that creativity? Now, over the years, I've developed lots of different projects. The initial spark came about in various ways. The easiest way is when a collaborator comes to you and says, hey, I have this great research idea. And then you just join them on the project. I have a few papers like this. And that's always nice to have the kind of collaborators who are creative. There are some people who are very good at that kind of project. They're very good at taking a project from 1 to 10. They don't do that much work though, going from 0 to 1, right? The initial spark. And there are people who specialize on that. They are more good at, they're better at that kind of the day-to-day of research and finishing off a project. I even know some people who define themselves as being the kind of person that takes a project from 8 to 10. They are closers, right? They really help out in the final stages of a project. But for a doctoral student, you're going to need to know the skills for all of those parts, 0 to 1, which is often the hardest, and then 1 to 10, and including, of course, the finishing part where you're actually submitting it, going through the review process, and all of that. But we're not going to touch on the endpoint now. We're going to focus on the 0 to 1 point. What I'm suggesting here is, even if right now a lot of your ideas are coming from collaborators, advisors, projects that you may have inherited, in the end, you will also be evaluated based on your ability to come up with new ideas, to be the true driver of research. And that's why it's so important to be able to spark new research ideas. So where does that come from? Where does creativity in general come from? Not just in the domain of marketing academia, but in general, how do humans develop creativity? It's not a new question. It's been studied for a very long time. And we want to try to draw on what has been learned about creativity also in our field. So what I'd like to present to you, and maybe some of you have seen this before, is a certain framework that's used to describe the creative process and just scholarly endeavors in general. Blind variation and selective retention, BVSR, as it's often called. It's also thought of as an evolutionary process. And I'm sharing with you a number of references here if you want to read that in further detail. And part of the reason I'm sharing this with you is this has been ingrained in my mind from the early days of my PhD, that our faculty at Wharton had shared this blind variation and selective retention. And I thought it was quite inspirational to think about how new ideas are created. And it's this idea that what we need to do is try to explore the environment in lots of different directions. And then we need to go through a filter to select our best ideas from that. So we need to generate a number of ideas going through all these different routes, allow our mind to wander in different directions. And that's the blind variation part. And then selective retention is where we become creative by picking out the ideas that are most promising. It's also about forging connections across areas. So another way to present this idea of the BVSR, blind variation selective retention, is through a quote. It's a quote that I really like by Linus Pauling, who is one of those double Nobel Prize winners. And he put it this way. He had an extremely productive and, of course, impactful career in the natural sciences and also the Nobel Peace Prize. And he said the way to get good ideas is to get lots of ideas and throw the bad ones away. Think about what that means. It's a key point about how we're even going about our process of developing ideas. It starts with volume. Come up with lots of ideas, because most of the ideas really are not going to have much of an impact, even for someone as productive, as famous as Linus Pauling. And I suspect Linus Pauling is not the first person who developed this quote. Like all quotes, they usually come from someone who was less famous, but we attribute it to the most famous person who later said it. So Linus Pauling said this. But even when you look at his career overall, yes, he had lots of ideas, some of which he pursued. He also had lots of papers, but only some of those have been award-winning and very influential. And if you look at the history of sciences, if you look at also in business school academia, the most impactful papers are often coming from those scholars who are just publishing a lot. By having lots of papers, some of those will have an impact. And the reason for this is not just about the fact that maybe they're better skilled at producing papers, at their research, they're more insightful, those kinds of things, but it's a basic reality of knowledge, which is it's very difficult to develop new knowledge in any field. And we never know what's actually going to have an impact in the end. So it's important to focus on volume there. So that's in the productivity of what when we think about our scholarly pursuits. But even in the idea generation part, we may have lots of ideas. Most of those are not that promising. So part of our responsibility is to develop a regular practice of actually creating lots of ideas, just brainstorming and taking note of those. So how do we do that? One thing is to read widely. And this is a part of this blind variation. Read not just in the area that you are studying right now. Obviously, that is important to develop a niche and also to become an expert in a certain area. But you also need to read widely across the marketing literature. So if you're a strategy person, perhaps read some papers on the quant side, read some CB papers, read some papers that are in a completely different domain within your discipline. So I try to read lots of other CB papers. Sometimes it's helpful to even just open up a journal and just read the articles without any pursuit of a certain topic. It's just you want the exposure. And hopefully you've gotten that also throughout your PhD, exposure to lots of different areas within the field. So that part is, of course, important, but I want to broaden that out because when we say read widely, our natural inclination is to say, okay, I'll read widely within my subdiscipline, I'll read widely within marketing, and I'll try to read those papers that are going to be easy to download. So papers that are easy to download are typically 2005 onwards. There's a lot of great content from older papers in our field and in the fields that we connect to. So for example, one of the papers that I've published, it was really sparked by, I was reading some work on memory. I found a reference to a paper that was very old, more than 100 years old in the memory literature. And I thought about that, and it had a lot of implications for the way consumers process information in a connected age when we're thinking about the internet. And that accessing that kind of very old publication ended up being the trigger for my idea. So there's a lot of content that was discovered years ago, 50, 70, 100 years ago that you can try to access. The paper won't look as neat as a paper that was published in the last 5 years. It won't have the right kind of methodology that we're accustomed to. Even the writing might be a bit stilted in your opinion, but try to take away the insights from that. So going also very old is important. The other part of reading widely is reading well outside of marketing. Now, if you're on the consumer behavior side, you likely are reading also a lot of psychology journals, and that's important. But I would go further. Read not just those that are adjacent to our fields, like psychology for CB, or economics for those who are analytical modelers. But going beyond that, think about reading some stuff in biology. There may be something really interesting there that relates to our work. Now, not everything. You can start to see what actually makes sense, what could be used. But part of your task as a marketing scholar is to be a scholar. That is, you're expected to be quite knowledgeable about lots of other fields too, just to be a smart, well-read person. And I think it would help also in developing research ideas. So think about having that as a regular practice. So as I present this, I want to hear from now the audience here, the participants. What fields are you reading in right now? What are some ways in which you're broadening out your reading? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this so that we can share with each other our experiences. What are you reading outside of marketing? You can put it through in the chat, or if you want to, computer science, that's great. Political science, JPSP, finance, philosophy, anthropology, environmental sciences, management science, sociology, management and international business, tourism. Right, these can all be really interesting. Some of them are closer to our area. And I know, of course, our time is limited, so we're not going to read that much in the fields outside, but do try to expose yourself to that, because sometimes that can trigger that creativity. All right, thanks for sharing that. That's great. That's the first thing, reading widely. The second thing, having many conversations. Academic research is, of course, not done in a silo, but is a conversation that we're having. We are publishing papers that are to be read by our field and hopefully people outside the field as well. And the whole process of actually publishing any work, we're giving presentations. We are, of course, have our reviewers of our papers. So all of this is inherently social. So what that also means then is the idea generation stage also needs to be social. It's unlikely that you sitting in your room reading a bunch of papers and reading a bunch of books are likely to derive new ideas that are going to be at the level of quality that you wanted to hit. You can develop new ideas, and that deep reading, that deep immersion is important. But then we need to put it out there. We need to try to have it make contact with the real world to help refine that idea, and to see also what might be sparked when we have conversations, and in an impromptu way, we might have new realizations that we then put into research. So having many conversations, and this is something that I've done as a practice throughout these years. And what's really important to me now, for example, is in addition to having lots of conversations with consumers, I try to have a lot of conversations with marketers. So I'm engaged in quite a few different industry engagement activities. So I'm working as an advisor on a marketing consultancy. When we look at our teaching, of course, we have executives that we teach to. And oftentimes these kinds of conversations, you start to see what are the real questions that marketers have right now. And that phenomenon can then be the basis for thinking about a research question. So they have a practical question, and that can then trigger a research question for you. So I would urge you to, if you can, have conversations, not just within our field, that is absolutely important. Have lots of conversations through DocSIG, through the conferences, and of course within your department, but then have many conversations with consumers. So talk to your friends who are not in our field, bright people who don't necessarily have exposure to our literature. Maybe they haven't even read some of the popular press books about consumer behavior or marketing, or of, let's say, big data. They know nothing about these things, but they're bright people and they may have certain questions. That could be one, consumers. Another source could be, of course, marketing practitioners. They may be struggling with an area of how to do certain analyses, how to extract information about their consumers, these practical problems that you can then learn about. So there's lots of different kinds of conversations that we could have. And what I'd like to now hear from the audience is, what are you doing right now to improve your network in this respect? who here has tried to connect with the business community, with marketers, practitioners, or has some connections maybe through their previous work or through family or friends? If you have such connections, please put it through the chat and share that with us. Louis says connections through influencer marketing channels. That's great. Melanie has a marketing company, lots of network and industry, plus do some consulting. Melanie works with chambers of commerce, and that's great. Any others? Marketing executives for keeping in contact with the ad industry, network and consulting industry. All right, and I see that some of you may not have had those industry experiences prior to your PhD. And for you, it may be important to really start to cultivate that network somehow, get an initial connection, start having some conversations so that, again, your ideas can make contact with the real world. Connections through friends. It's harder in the pandemic, of course, Ezra. Hopefully we're getting out of it soon and we can make more of those connections. All right, thanks for sharing that. So that is the second part that I would urge you to look at is how can you have more conversations to spark more ideas? The next thing, another practical part of it is, in addition to exposing your brain to people and reading materials and podcasts that came through also in the chat. I'm a huge fan of podcasts. You can listen to various podcasts from marketing. There's several podcasts that are, again, about what are the kinds of questions that marketing executives have today? What are questions in the business world? You can listen to podcasts of certain industries. So I listened to a podcast from the Retail Federation, from the ad industry. Sorry, I just saw there's a poll. Okay, what has been the best channel you have found for idea generation? Partner, spouse, cohort, members, friends, conferences, receptions, articles, popular press readings, podcasts. Yes, please do answer on that. Would love to hear. But podcasts can be a great wealth of knowledge. If you don't have the direct connection, you can at least then see the kinds of conversations people are having. Okay, so we've exposed our brain to lots of different sources of ideas. Now what do we do with that? Well, one important thing is to keep an idea journal. And this is a very basic idea, but if you want to get a nice notebook, leather bound, if you want to make it especially attractive notebook, that's fine. I prefer to actually write it down on paper rather than just typing it in. So I write it and then I enter it into a Google Sheet. Actually, I also keep both a digital version and an analog version. Right? For me, it's just, I feel more creative when I'm writing things down. But to each their own. How many of you keep some kind of journal to list ideas? And maybe, Ezra, that could actually be a poll if you want after this one. It'd be nice to know how many of you are keeping an idea journal. It's something I encourage for our PhD students, and I sometimes see them writing furiously in their idea journal. Right, so writing notes app on my phone. And I think that's great too. There's been a few times where late at night, I'm somewhere, I'm on the tube here, and an idea just comes to me. I don't have my idea journal. So out comes the notes on my phone and I just type it in. Sometimes that can happen because I'm on the tube and I see an advertisement there that triggers an idea. Most of those times, those ideas are not that great, but it does help me as an exercise to keep thinking about ideas. All right, OneNote is a great one for that as well. Word doc where you drop in random ideas. That's great. And some people like to be very organized with this. Others like to be a bit messier. I don't think there's necessarily one way is better than the other. We just need some way to be able to retain those ideas, because otherwise they go in our brain and out and forgotten. And then we may regret that we didn't write down different ideas. Okay, so this poll, Ezra, are you able to see what the results of the poll were?
I think Louis can.
Okay. Lewis, what was the results of the poll?
I just launched the journal poll now.
Okay. All right.
Looks like 70-ish% so far are that they do have some sort of notebook or notes app to jot down ideas.
Perfect. So the other 30%, I would suggest look into how you might do this. Again, every person has a different solution. Okay, so that is on just at a more practical level. How do we get our brain to be more creative? How do we then also write down these ideas? Again, a lot of it is about exposure. It needs to come from that passion, of course. We need to first start off by thinking, I want to try to solve marketing problems. I want to address this issue in the world that a marketing scholar could speak to. And if you have that passion, your brain will be constantly working and you'll be making connections. The other point on all this is when we think about what creativity is, it's taking an idea from here, cross-pollinating it with another discipline, and then we have a nice idea. So I've seen great papers in our field that have not just relied, again, on our adjacent disciplines, but very different disciplines. Aesthetics, for example, linguistics. These are some of the ones that I've seen in the behavioral domain, and I'm sure you've seen many other kinds of papers in other subdisciplines as well. Okay, so that is on just the broad level. Now we also need to think about another approach for developing ideas, and this comes from a framework that I share with our PhD students. I think this is an excellent paper 2012 in JCP by Lynch et al., Knowledge Creation and Consumer Research. Now, this is about behavioral work, but the same ideas apply to many other disciplines. In fact, I teach this in an experimental design and analysis class that is read by students in OB and also students who are not doing behavioral work at all in management and in marketing. So they also were able to apply this framework to their own discipline. But if you look at it, it's a 2x2 matrix. I think every good matrix should be 2x2. And in this case, it is about where our intended contribution is and how we are actually developing that idea. So is our contribution intended to be to theory, or is it to practice? And are we following a deductive approach or non-deductive approach? Ezra, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I think you kind of answered my question, because I was like, and I've seen this like even at my school, that we're trained differently with different supervisors. Some kind of make us think of the methodology first and the designs first, versus some make you think of theory first. So what is the way to sort of go ahead and spearhead at an idea and sort of fail fast so that this works and this doesn't work?
Yeah, so what I would say to that, Ezra, is there's not one approach that's necessarily better than the other. Of course, different people have their own tastes. Some people prefer more theory-based contributions. Others prefer more practical, substantive contributions. That's there. And also reviewers have their own tastes and editors have their own tastes. And we need a sense of that. But there are potentially great papers in all of these potential areas, right? In all four of these, in this 2x2 matrix. So let me give you an example, and we can see what I mean here. And the examples here are going to be a wide range, not just in CB. So let's look at the contribution that is intended for theory. Conceptual contribution via deduction. So I'm looking at the top left box there, this cell. An example I give here is, let's say you're reading a lot of literature on present bias and hyperbolic discounting. You're going deep into that literature, and then perhaps you're reading something well outside, either something outside of psychology, something very different that leads you to a new process explanation for present bias hyperbolic discounting. It's a new process explanation. Hyperbolic discounting is a known thing. It's well established in literature. Perhaps that process explanation is not going to have that many practical implications, because what do marketing managers care about? They care that discounting exists. Hyperbolic discounting is also useful to know. Why exactly it happens from a psychological mechanism perspective could be useful, but perhaps that is too detailed beyond what is necessary to get the job done. But it does advance the literature a lot if you can develop this new process explanation. So that is an area in which you can try to build out your creativity, conceptual contributions via deduction, where you're reading the theory, and then that's the basis for which you are then developing new ideas. Staying now within that theory row, the next cell, a non-deductive approach to conceptual contributions. For example, let's say you wanted to develop some theoretical contributions related to how the macroeconomic conditions affect product purchases. How does economy, the state of the economy, how does that influence the way consumers purchase? Now, you could go through the literature and try to develop a theory. That's a nice approach. But what this approach would be instead, in a non-deductive approach, is you get a data set. You start looking through the data, find some interesting relationships, and then from that, you try to develop your theory. We need to be mindful of, let's say the data would show us something, but that doesn't replicate. So then we find another data set to replicate those results. But it's the finding that then sparks the new contribution. So it starts with an actual empirical observation, and then the idea comes from that. So that's our top row on theory. Our second row is the substantive domain. That is, you're trying to help, again, on the more practical side. Let's look at that third cell, substantive contributions via deduction. So we're using theory-based interventions to influence systems. So let's take this example. Let's say you have a very applied question about how do we improve product perception? And you've been reading through some of the practitioner literature, and you're seeing that this is a question that they're having. You can apply theory from aesthetics to this domain, and that would be a nice substantive and deductive contribution. Finally, let me do the fourth cell, then we have one question as well. Non-deductive substantive contribution, and this would be practical impact, and discovered through a non-deductive way. So analyzing a big data set to test the effect of nutrition labels on healthy eating. One of my colleagues has worked on exactly this kind of topic. So lots of different approaches. I think there are, again, multiple ways of leading to knowledge. As I said, you may have your own taste, but there are many successful examples of using each of these approaches. All right, so we had a question. I'm not sure if I can pronounce the name, but the hand raised, if you could just.
Yeah, hi, my name is Chija. And yes, and so I have a question about about non-deductive and discovery through data. So actually, I love this idea, but when I joined the PhD program and when I talked with my supervisors, I think they just like refresh my mind about like, so students have to focus on theory-driven, ideas. So like I had a very hard time, to reconcile, between data and theory. So I love this idea, but it seems to me it's like hypothesis as a driven should be a prime, prerequisite for like for academia. And so yeah, so I had a hard time, to follow this rule, because like it's more like data driven. It's more popular in the industry, but in academia it's more like p-hacking, has been criticized by many others. And so actually we have many beautiful patterns when we analyze the data, but sometimes it's very hard to find a good theory to explain something, because like if you can explain something by just showing the data to your friends and explain to them, well, you may see that your friends will just just like a defense with different alternative explanations. But if we use traditional consumer behavior approach, typically we have only one mediators or two mediators. But in in the mind of our friends, well, actually in their mind, actually it's a structural equation modeling.
Yeah, so it's a great question. How do we take on this challenge of just following a certain approach? I think, well, one, I'd certainly urge you to look at this article, because I think what it shows you lots of great examples of papers that have been successful in each of these buckets. And yes, each of those areas has its advantages and disadvantages as well. So discovering through data has its disadvantages, but so does just building on theory, because the problem there is, again, not making contact with the real world. That could be a problem, and not knowing if it would actually be observed in data. Now, the other point I had there was, it is also very largely a matter of taste. And I do see some advantages for when you're a PhD student to build up that theory knowledge, so to show that you can derive new ideas based on theory, the deductive approach. But that doesn't necessarily mean we need to follow that throughout our careers. There's a lot of points at which you might follow one of the other three cells. And so this is just a way to try to broaden out how can we develop ideas. Okay, so with all that said, we've talked about more the blind variation, developing ideas. Let's talk more on how do we retain these ideas? How do we decide which ones are worthy to pursue, and then actually go out there and produce this work? So what I want to start with here is just a reminder that this is really tough. Not much is new under the sun. And very often we're reading a paper and we're saying, okay, that's a nice finding, but I suspect that the basic idea was also found 50 years ago. Or the main point of this article, probably the ancients talked about this 3,000 years ago, right? There's a lot of that kind of content coming out in every field, really. So not much is new under the sun. And I think, if anything, this last couple of years has taught us during the pandemic is that the nature of our ignorance is really quite profound. That is, there's just so much out there that we can't know. And the harder and harder we try to know about the world, the more mystery still exists. It's very tough to develop new knowledge. So it's, of course, helpful to have lots of ideas, but we should also appreciate this, that probably most of those ideas are not going to go anywhere. Either it has been done, or it's something that isn't actually true. That's probably the bigger problem. Most knowledge does not survive for that long. In fact, there's this concept of the half-life of knowledge. Many of the findings in, not just in business academia, but in medicine, in the basic sciences, after some time, that knowledge is replaced with something else. So the question is, what kind of knowledge will stick at least for some time? That's what we're trying to do here. We don't want to just produce papers. We're here to produce knowledge for the world, especially in the world of marketing. Let's see, comment here. Right, there's a lot of pressure on publication, of course, and we need to acknowledge it. So this is why we need to have lots of ideas so that we can select good ones and actually pursue them and be productive. So with that said, not much is new under the sun. Knowing that challenge, we need to think about selective retention. How do we select our most promising ideas? And for this, one of the things I'm going to ask you to consider, and this is something that I use, and I use this all the time in the selective retention part, the use of checklists. So I don't know if any of you have read this. It's an excellent book called The Checklist Manifesto. It's about how checklists can be really helpful for us in our thinking, because we often will forget key points. The selective retention is about applying a set of criteria that may be loosely defined in our head to screening out research ideas. So you've generated lots of ideas. How do you select whether to go ahead on a certain project? So what I do is, over the years, what I realized is there's a lot of criteria and I often forget those. So I have prepared a checklist that I use to filter through ideas. Someone presents an idea to me, I say, hold on. Before we talk about the idea in depth, let me pull out the checklist and see if it meets these points. If it does, then we can have a conversation. If it does not, then let's see what parts of that checklist are potentially a struggle and is there a way to overcome it? And many of the ideas do not pass the checklist and then don't turn into projects and don't turn into papers. And that way you can try to avoid years of agony of chasing an idea that you later find has certain problems. So what is on this checklist? Like with the idea generation part, this part is also personalized to you. I think you should all develop your own checklist. And I'm going to give you just 2 of the items on my checklist. I try to keep my checklist relatively streamlined. It's only 12 items. And I'm just going to share with you the 1 and 12, because a lot of these are not going to fit your field necessarily or your taste. But one of which, the basic one, is mutual fit. So someone presents an idea to me, a co-author. I have a number of co-authors that I've been working with over several years. We're all good friends. We just have research chats all the time. We kick around ideas that we see in our notepads, in our idea journals. But the first thing I say, okay, that's a nice idea, fun in theory, but the topic, if it doesn't fit your expertise and my expertise and research interests, should we really pursue it? It's going to require us learning a whole new literature. And perhaps we won't be as successful as those who already know these areas well. So this, I think, is a filter. I don't mean to put this number 1 simply because it's the most important. I'm just sharing it with you. It just appears at the top on my list personally. Let's see, we had a comment here in the chat on this. Checklist manifesto, thanks for sharing that, Louis, that's great. So for me, that's then a filter. And many ideas get filtered out based on this one. Because it's very easy to be creative and come up with lots of ideas, but they don't help you along your objective of being known for a certain area within the discipline. And if we don't have our interests and our expertise in mind, we're just making it more difficult on ourselves. The 12th one, I'm not going through 2 through 11, but what I have here is, even after going through all the different things, I check to see if the idea has been scooped. And I have a list of places that I go to see if it's been scooped. And what I mean by this is, okay, look, a lot of us are studying similar topics. So I don't mean at that level, but sometimes our specific insight is actually one that has been scooped. And I learned this one actually the hard way, as you can imagine, why I have this here. So it has to do with my dissertation. So when I was a PhD student, I was getting ready for my dissertation defense. And the same faculty member who had shared with me the selective, the framework for thinking about developing ideas, he said, oh, wait a minute, you're about to present your defense. By the way, I just came across this paper in JCR. And I looked at it and my heart sank and oh no, this is it. This is actually most of the contributions that I was hoping for with this paper were captured in this forthcoming JCR, which I didn't know about because of course it had not yet been published. But had I been looking through conference proceedings a little bit more actively, looked in a few other places, I probably would have found it. The silver lining of this story, though, is I actually met the author of the other paper a couple years later at a conference, and then we started collaborating together. And actually, she's now one of my closest co-authors. So that we always try to turn these things around. But nonetheless, I learned the key lesson, which is not to get scooped. And we do this by checking out not just the papers that have been published, but where you might expect people are sharing their work out there that might be similar to what you're working on. So recently accepted articles, just accepted articles, Google searching topics, looking through, in my case for behavioral work, I'm looking through also behavioral conferences to see what's out there. So now what I'd like to hear from you, and we can put this through in the chat. What do you have in your checklist? If you have a checklist, not everyone has a checklist. I think this is, I must say, this is more of a peculiar practice that I follow. I don't think this is widespread practice yet, but I'm encouraging it for my students here. And we had a question, any tips on how you have been able to develop the checklist? So for me, it's taken over time. I've looked at what has been the cause for some of my papers in the past to get rejected. I look at its core, some of the problems could be X, Y, etc. So I'm looking at that, I'm saying, okay, now that I know that this could be a problem later on, let me take care of it up front when the idea is presented to me raw in its initial stages, so that I don't follow the wrong path there. So for me, it's that. Of course, it requires a lot of careful effort of thinking about what makes for a good publication. What I'd like you to do, though, and let's try to actually answer that question right here and now. What would you include on your checklist? What would, after developing an idea, an idea's been sparked, what filter would you use at this point? And maybe we can share that with each other. So put certain criteria in through the chat. Data accessibility, right? We need to know that we can actually find field data, but it has to excite me. Makes theoretical and managerial contributions. So there we might say, what kind of theoretical contribution needs to make? That's one item on the checklist. And another item is, what is a managerial contribution? Worthwhile science gap. So is there a question in the literature? Whether doable or not, right? So I think for many of you, your checklist may change over the years. When you're a PhD student, you have a certain timeline, right? You want to get a paper advanced enough to go on the job market, and you also have the tenure clock potentially later on that you need to work towards. Once you've been tenured, then you can relax that a bit more, but certainly that checklist can change throughout your career. Is the idea interesting and important to study? Yeah, so that's definitely, those are important attributes, but I would suggest put it as, and that's more of a gut feel, but I think we want to define that a little bit better. So is the idea interesting? How would we fill that out a little bit? So it's in, I saw a good one above, it's I find it interesting. I would like to work on it, and that's an approach. My co-authors find it that they like it. Is it important? Important in what way? Relevance to managers, right? So now we all know these points, but again, I think if you look through the Checklist Manifesto book that Louis shared, you'll see that these ideas, we often forget them. Even just a list of 12 things, that's all I have, 12 things. We can't easily keep 12 things in mind when we're having discussions, right? Think about Miller's magic number. So that's why I suggest actually writing it down. So I have certain things like, is the independent variable clearly defined as a construct? To me, that's important. I'm not as particular about the dependent measure. The dependent measure needs to be more practical, and I put that as a point. But the independent variable, often construct clarity becomes a key issue for the IV, and so that's on my checklist. Surprising, not an obvious finding. Yeah, so for me, I have a checklist item, not that it has to be counterintuitive, but it should be non-intuitive. And who should it be non-intuitive to? I put that down. Right, so what I would recommend here are not just brief adjectives, but actual sentences that express what you want to go through in your filter. Right, so that's something for you to work on after this session. Okay, let's continue from there. Now we have applied our checklist. We started to work on some projects. The question is when to drop failing research ideas. And this is, of course, where we need to think about sunk costs. This is a really tricky one. We become emotionally attached to ideas, but just like with the sunk cost fallacy, the key way to think about it is, what is the best use of my time going forward? There's many times that I have looked at a paper and thought, look, this paper is not really going that well now, but here's this other paper that I think is progressing quite nicely. And there's the opportunity cost that if I spend more time on this paper that's not really going to make it, I'm going to miss out on the chance to build up that paper that it could actually go much faster. There's certain papers where I'm 2 years in and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking it's going to take another 3 years to get this paper done. Meanwhile, I could start a new paper now and submit it within 3 years. So maybe just forget about these past 2 years and move on. And again, we're here to produce scholarly output. We're here to produce knowledge. We're not here to produce papers. That's not why we're in this field. And there's a lot of ideas that we should drop because publishing it just because we can doesn't mean we should. And what I mean by that is we don't want to go out there and just be mining noise, adding poor knowledge into the world. We want to have good impacts with what we do. And it's not just about managing projects. When we look at it as a hiring committee, let's say to hire new assistant professors, we're not looking to hire a set of papers. We're looking to hire someone who has a set of skills, who thinks deeply about marketing and has the potential to do great research in the future. Not here's what they're working on right now, that's it. And what I mean by that is sometimes it may be better to cut out bad projects and dedicate your efforts instead to upskilling, improving your knowledge of the literature, learning new analysis techniques, being an overall marketing scholar better, even if that means you actually are not producing quite as much just yet. If you have good work, of course, continue to push that. But if you feel that there's some work that's really not up to the level that you'd like, then maybe it's better to drop that. Again, focus on those other things that would make you a better colleague, a better marketing scholar. Point here in the chat. Yes, publishing in a top journal is absolutely a pressure, and we need to get that for tenure. So that's why we cannot be just coasting. To continue with the boating analogy, we cannot just coast for several years and try to be well skilled. We also need to produce work. But what I'm trying to get at here is a paper that's poorly done, at some point you realize it's going to take just as much time to build this back up and make it a good paper as it would be to start a whole new project. So you might as well, if you think that it's not going to go there, just move on to the other project. And another way we think about it is it takes as long to write a bad paper as it does to write a good paper, just because of the way the review process is and how long it takes to collect data, to do the different steps. So you might as well write a good paper. All right, so the question, how do we assess ideas which will make it into an A journal versus not? So that's where our checklist comes into play. And that's what I would recommend here. Develop your checklist based on that filter. If you're going for A-star top journals, then create your checklist based on that. Someone else may not be going for that, may be focused on developing a niche, in which case their checklist would look quite different. Okay, so one last point before we wrap up is about slow motion multitasking, and I'll be quite brief here. There's a nice article and a TED Talk by Tim Harford, who is a British economist author. He popularizes a lot of what we find in our field as well. And he has this talk about slow motion multitasking, which is this idea that a lot of the best discoveries by scientists and even other creative thinkers, it comes from having lots of different projects happening over an extended time. And the examples that he gives include Darwin and Einstein. And so they were all working on lots of projects, moving from one project, pausing on it, moving on to the other project, and so on and so forth. Slow motion multitasking. That doesn't mean they're literally multitasking where they have one screen where they have one project, another screen where they have another project. I mean, over the week, maybe 1 week they're working on one project, and the next week they work on a different project. We sometimes need our brain to take a break from one topic and move on to the other one. And sometimes we make connections by doing that. And again, I view the ignorance we have and how much knowledge potentially is out there, that is this force pushing against us. It's really hard to come up with new knowledge. And that's why it may take a long hunch where over several years, you're reading widely, you're refining your ideas. If anyone has seen the way in which Darwin developed the theory of evolution over a few decades, it came from that slow hunch, seeing connections from this species to another species and so on and so forth. Now, none of us is ever going to be as influential as Darwin. Let's put that to the side. But within our discipline of what we want to achieve, that also could be inspired by this slow motion multitasking. So a few different projects we see as they develop. Now, you may have received advice that you should only work on X number of projects at a time. I think there's a lot of value in that too. And that's more about going from, for example, 0.8 to 10 on that 10-point scale. At any given point, the finishing job should be focused on no more than a few projects. But that 0 to 1 and that 1 to 3, this kind of range where we're in the early stages, maybe let that simmer for a long time. And maybe it won't even get published until you're going up for tenure, right? That's fine. But again, what we're looking for when we hire people are people who are curious about marketing, who are well-trained, and who are ready to tackle problems, even if they take a long time. All right, so with all that said, I want to wrap up there and take maybe a few minutes for questions. I don't know how we're doing on time, Louis and Ezra, but
we did start just a few minutes late, but to be conscious of your time and you know your efforts here, maybe we can take maybe 2 or 3 questions and then we'll wrap up from
yeah,
there.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's just take 2 or 3 questions. And I'll try to be brief here. Of course, because we have the slow motion multitasking. Thank you for sharing that. And what I really want to be conscious of here, I remember my PhD days when you would get a lot of advice about how to be a scholar, and they wouldn't be filtered enough from this idea that, look, I've got limited time here, right? I need to be much more practical. I need papers to go on the market. We should all acknowledge this. But again, what I'm trying to do here is to share with you that, yes, that is really important, but you're going to be evaluated on not a whole lot of output. And it's also absolutely vital to be seeing that you have the promise, that you're well-trained, that you think also for the future. And also considering it's a long game. I mean, academia is many, many years. So coming up with these ideas, this whole approach, we need to be mindful of that part of it too. All right, let's see, other questions? Oh.
Yeah, I was just going to say a question from Brandon.
Oh,
Sorry.
Oh yeah, Brandon's got a question in the chat here of how do you assess the degree of contribution of an idea early in the process?
That's a great question, Brandon. So I would say to go back to this framework again and try to see where exactly in the knowledge creation process, where do you want to make a contribution? Evaluate it from that perspective. And it needs to be strong on one of these, on theory or on practice. And having those conversations, if it's about practice, then you need to talk to practitioners and see, is this really important to you? If it's about theory, then you need to have conversations with people within your subdiscipline to see, look, if I were to discover this thing, how important would it be? I think having conversations is the key to this because we tend to inflate the contributions of our ideas, and others may not see it that way. And particularly reviewers, and especially reviewer B, right? That's what we always say. Reviewer number 2, right? All right.
Piggybacking off of this. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I'll just take Jorge's question then. How to balance producing a volume of articles versus going after the next big thing in a top journal when you're finishing PhD and starting academic career. For most of us, it's not really an either or, right? Most of us are not going to have the next big paper, right? I mean, that's just the reality that only certain papers are going to win those awards. So I would say if you do have the next big paper, certainly go for it. But most of us can see our ideas and say, look, this is publishable. It's not going to necessarily win an award. And that's what I'm going to focus on there. Not everyone is going for the top hits. If you have the luxury of doing that, if you have the skills, then I think you want to go for that because probably that is then how you're being evaluated. Louis, there was.
Yeah, I think we can wrap up from there with just maybe a final talking point. It seemed like a lot of the questions and even some of the verbal questions, I forget who exactly had asked before, but with our disciplines in the social sciences, it kind of depends on the school of thought that you're coming from and who it is you're researching with in your PhD program. And so I suppose that's one of the big benefits of joining a new program is that you get a bunch of different insight and different ways of thinking about research ideas, which may help your collaboration process. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's also helpful to have a lot of conversations in this community in DocSIG, and because we often, I thought that question from the one student who was saying that pushed or urged to go through a certain approach for developing ideas, we can see that other advisors have different tastes, and that may not be the right approach for you. But we also have to be practically constrained here that in many ways, you need to work within your department. If there's certain sources of data, certain tastes of how research is done, how dissertation is evaluated, then we need to follow that approach, and we can always broaden it out later. But just be aware of what you're doing, which is fine. Be aware of what you're objectives are, and that should be on your checklist. And again, this is going to vary across people. It's going to vary across disciplines and what kind of job you hope to land as well.
Well, with that, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. And I think I speak on behalf of all of DocSIG that says thank you for giving us this time late in the evening to, you provide a lot of great insight, and we got a lot of great different data points there in the chat, like with the TED Talk and the book and some of the other links. This meeting, this webinar was recorded, so it'll be posted on our DocSIG social media links. You can find the recording on our YouTube channel. And I'm also going to go ahead and post the PDF to all the future endeavors that DocSIG is going to have at Winter AMA. Dr. Bhargave, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully we have you on again.
Thank you, Louis, and it was an absolute pleasure. And thanks again for all the great questions. Hopefully many of you can connect also at Winter AMA or at a future conference. If you do see me at a future conference, please say hello if I didn't get a chance to chat with you today.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.